Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into a question that's right at the heart of, well, everything we think we know. How do we actually justify what we believe is true? So let's get right into it with a question you've probably wrestled with at some point. Just pick something you believe, something you're absolutely sure of. Got it? Okay, now, how do you know it's true? What's your proof? And here's the kicker. What's your proof for that proof? Yeah, you see where this is going, right? It gets tricky fast. The moment you start playing that why game, you can find yourself tumbling down this rabbit hole of justifications that just seems to never end. This isn't just a fun little thought experiment. Philosophers actually have a name for it, the infinite regress problem. I mean, think about it. If every single belief needs another belief to prop it up, you're stuck with this chain that either goes on forever, which is kind of mind-bending, or it loops back on itself. Or maybe it stops somewhere. But if it stops, where? What's that final bedrock belief that doesn't need any other justification? So, to try and solve this exact puzzle, two really big ideas came along. And each one gives us a powerful way to picture how our knowledge is all put together. So, you've got these two competing models. On one hand, you have foundationalism. And the name kind of gives it away, right? It pictures our knowledge like a pyramid built on a solid foundation of basic, self-evident truths. But today we're going to focus on the other big idea, coherentism. And this one says, nope, it's not a pyramid. It's more like a giant, sprawling, interconnected web. So in this web view, no single belief has to be the superstar, the one unshakable foundation for everything else. It's not about finding one solid anchor. Instead, a coherentist would ask something like, does this new belief fit? Does it make the entire web of my other beliefs stronger and more consistent? It's all about how everything hangs together. And there's a really great analogy for this from the philosopher C.I. Lewis. Imagine a courtroom trial. One witness gets up and their story is okay, but maybe a little shaky on its own. Not enough to convict. But then a second witness tells the same story. And a third, and a fourth. Suddenly, even if each testimony is individually a little weak, the way they all lock together, the way they cohere, that becomes incredibly convincing. That's the power of the web. Okay, so this web of belief sounds pretty elegant, right? It feels intuitive. But there's a massive, glaring problem. What happens if that perfectly woven web isn't actually connected to anything in the real world? This right here is the heart of what's called the isolation objection. You could, in theory, build a flawless, logical system of beliefs where every single piece supports every other piece. A beautiful, intricate web that's just floating in space, a complete fantasy with no connection to what's actually true. And this leads to two giant problems for coherentism. First, think about an epic fantasy world like, say, The Lord of the Rings. It's incredibly coherent, right? The maps, the languages, the histories, it all fits together perfectly. But we don't mistake it for reality. The second problem is the alternative systems issue. You can have two completely contradictory conspiracy theories, and both can be internally consistent, perfectly coherent webs. But they can't both be true. So if coherence is all you've got, how on earth do you choose? So to fight back against these objections, defenders of coherentism knew they had to do more. They had to prove that a coherent story wasn't just a good story. They had to show that coherence itself somehow points towards the truth. The big question became, is coherence truth conducive? That's the fancy term for it. But all it really means is, if you have a more coherent set of beliefs, does that make it more likely, more probable, that those beliefs are actually true? And this is where things took a really interesting turn. Philosophers decided to take this idea out of the realm of pure argument and put it to the test, using math. They started translating the idea of coherence into the cold, hard language of probability theory. The goal was to prove, once and for all, that a more coherent story is, mathematically, a more probable one. But what they found was, well, it was kind of a shock. It was absolutely not what the die-hard coherentists were expecting. In fact, the results of these mathematical tests were so counterintuitive, they really shook the whole theory to its core. They came up with these formal proofs. They're actually called the impossibility results. And the verdict was just stunning. It turns out that making a story more coherent does not mathematically guarantee that it's more probable. And get this, sometimes it can even make it less probable.
Let me give you a super simple example to show how this works, because it's a bit of a brain bender. Okay, so imagine you hear two things. 1, Tweety is a bird. 2, Tweety cannot fly. Kind of weird, right? It doesn't seem very coherent. But now, what if we add a third piece of information? Tweety is a penguin. Aha! Now the story makes perfect sense. It's way more coherent. But here's the catch, the mathematical trap. The probability of any 3 specific things being true is always less than the probability of just 2 of them being true. So by adding that detail that made the story feel better, we actually made the whole package statistically less likely.
So, wow. If coherence can't guarantee truth, does that mean we should just toss the whole idea in the bin? Is it useless? Well, no, not at all. It just means we have to rethink what its job actually is. The way most philosophers think about it now is that coherence isn't a creator of justification, it's more like an amplifier. It can't just make up justification from nothing. But if you start with beliefs that have even a tiny little bit of credibility on their own, say from something you saw with your own eyes, coherence can take that faint signal, turn up the volume, and weave it into a belief system that's way, way stronger. So what is coherence good for, then? Well, it's still an absolutely crucial tool in our mental toolkit. It's how we pick the inference to the best explanation out of a bunch of competing stories. It's what gives us that surge of confidence when lots of different independent sources are all pointing to the same conclusion. And maybe the most practical use of all? It's our own internal BS detector, flagging when our own beliefs just don't add up. And really, that leaves us with a pretty important takeaway. Look, we are all constantly weaving these webs of belief to make sense of the world around us. And coherence is the tool we use to make that web strong and tight and logical. But the big lesson from this whole story is that even with the most beautiful web, we can't ever stop asking ourselves that one crucial question. Is this thing actually anchored to the ground? Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.